Hey, good peoples of APUSH. Welcome to this APUSH question and answer stream. My name is Caleb Bloggery. I'm a teacher of APUSH as well as some other things, AP World, regular U.S. history in Michigan, and I'm joining you here live during this rather interesting period. So follow us at social media if you're interested in some of those quicker updates than we can have on these live streams. Twitter is a great place to look for that, especially. Talking about period 8 highlights, is that something that you folks would still be interested in? Would you like to cover some different topics? Would you just like to continue this question and answer session? Let me know in the chat. Are you interested in covering some period 8? Are you still getting tested over that? Might be useful. Are you in the middle of that right now, just online? Is your teacher still going to be requiring that? I don't know, but we can still talk about period 8 if you'd like to. We can talk about other periods. Looks like Perla would like some period 8 highlights, which is good. I'm a big fan of period 8. I think it's my favorite period by far. Isaiah wants some period 9 stuff. Broad overview of period 8 and 9. Okay, yeah, so we can do some of that. And then Rachel says you're beginning period 7 in class, so maybe we can do some of that. Cool. Rachel, can I ask you to put the period 7 question in the ask a question function? That way if it gets swallowed up by the chat, we can still talk about it. Middle of period 7, period 8 and 9, especially after Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. Yes, Grace. Yep, that's right where we are, right? Connect it more to other periods, also review the other. Okay, let's just turn this into a complete APUSH review of all of the content. Why don't we? All right, let's do it. Let's get into it. Let's see. So yes, Rachel, thank you for that question. That will be great. All right, so let's cover period 8 just really, really briefly, and then we'll do period 9, and then we'll sort of go do some backtracking. How's that sound? So give you as much review as we can in the about half an hour that we have left. Oh yeah, we are going to do future streams on those too. Don't worry. I'm the one that's doing the APUSH cram reviews, and so if you sign up for those cram passes, I believe it's next week. Thursday is the first one at 9 p.m. and I'll be covering periods 1 through 3 as a preparation for exam review. Now that might change depending on the schedule and everything. Now that we have this announcement, but that's the plan as of right now. So. And then we'll also be doing just general fiveable APUSH streams too. But if you're interested in some like legit, really hardcore review, that cram pass is a really good idea still. But yeah, we can cover as much as we can now, right, Danielle? May as well. So let's talk some period 8, shall we? Your really, really big topics. If I had to give you like 3 big topics for period 8, it'd be these 3 right here. Cold War, the Rights Revolution, and economy and culture. Perla, I'm not exactly sure. I feel like a cram pass would be a good idea regardless of what the announcement is. It's going to be reviewing all the content anyway. And that'd probably be your best way to ensure a lot of good review. So I don't think I would necessarily wait on that. They might change their content based on, if the College Board says only multiple choice, well, then we're doing a bunch of multiple choice. If the College Board says only FAQs or DBQs, we're doing a lot of DBQ stuff. But either way, the content will stay the same. So I'd say it's worth it to get it right now just because we're going to be covering period 1 through 3 and the content won't change. So yeah, I wouldn't say you necessarily have to wait on that. So back to period 8, big highlights, big topics for period 8, Cold War, Rights Revolution, and economy and culture. A reminder that period 8 is going to be from 1945 to 1980. 1945 is the end of World War II. It's the start of the Cold War-ish. Question for you folks that you can answer in the chat. Why does period 8 end in 1980? What's the big event that happens in 1980 that changes at least some of the tenor of American history such that it requires its own new period? Close, Susan, close. End of the Cold War is coming. That's in 1989 or 1991, depending on how you define it. I mean, that would make sense, right? If I was in charge, I might end it there too. A lot of historians end it in 1991 with the end of the Cold War. That means period 9 is very, very short. Great guess, and very logical too. Sierra and Abofu got it. Reagan's election, yes. 1980 is the Reagan administration, this Reagan revolution. Long time coming. It's been building up for a while, but 1980s Reagan's election, it takes the United States in a rightward conservative shift. Hopefully that's the right direction for you folks, even though I'm on a webcam. For me, it's to the right. For you, it might be this way. But anyway, it takes the United States to the right, and it means the United States is a bit more conservative from then on, as opposed to, say, the earlier years of post-Cold War or post-World War II liberalism, FDR's New Deal, Johnson's Great Society, etc. Yeah, so that's period 8 in sort of a nutshell from its bookends. Now let's talk about the big topics. Cold War. You need to be aware of the Cold War and how that influences virtually everything. It continues on until 1991, so it's in the background of all of period 8. You need to be aware of the rights revolution, and we might even add a little S at the end there because there's a whole bunch of other groups that are fighting for their rights as well. And then the economy and the culture continue to change in profound ways during period 8. Let's just talk about what that looks like in a bit more detail. So, Cold War overview. A reminder that it's the United States against the Soviet Union. It's a big push against each other for influence, for power. It never actually heats up into armed conflicts. There's no nukes that are used against each other. That's why it's called a Cold War. It doesn't heat up into actual armed conflict. But I think that there are certainly some hot wars that you should be aware of, right? So you should be aware of things like Korea, of Vietnam. You should be aware of proxy wars and coup d'etats, things like that. I'm going to keep this a little bit shorter than I had intended just because we want to get to some other review too. And Jeremy asked a fantastic question that we'll get to in a little bit. When do the parties start switching, right? And when do we get that whole, yeah, we'll talk about that. Red Scare. Red Scare during period 8, remember, is the second Red Scare. The first one happened in 1919 with the Palmer raids after World War I in response to the Bolshevik Revolution. This is the second Red Scare. So this is McCarthyism. And so there's a fear of communists at home, just like we're doing containment in the Truman Doctrine abroad. There's containment at home through the Red Scare and McCarthyism. The economy after World War II is booming. There's the baby boom, literally. There's the growth of suburbs. There's the growth of single-family households. There's the GI Bill that helps middle class or lower class white people move into the middle class. It's largely marked whites only, which is going to set up all kinds of problems for the United States that still affect us today. But the economy after World War II works really well. High levels of unionization. Lots of people are able to find jobs. The economy goes really, really well. And peak purchasing power for the United States worker is going to peak in the early 1960s. So there's this huge economic boom time from 1945 all the way until the early 1960s. Things are going really well for a lot of Americans, not for all of them, obviously. American culture after World War II starts to change. Remember, the 50s are often compared to the 20s. There's things like youthful rebellion movements like the beatniks, whereas in the 20s there were flappers, right? You have rock and roll and the Kinsey sexuality studies, just like in the 20s you had jazz and flappers again, right? All that kind of new sexuality stuff. We're going to have the civil rights movement start. There's kind of two phases to it, right? There's the Truman desegregates the military in 48, and then there's the early civil rights movements in 1950s, like Brown v. Board of Education in 54 is a must-know, and then MLK, Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott is in 1960, Emmett Till's murder in 1955. Check out Mr. May's stream from, I believe it was yesterday, if you're interested more about the civil rights movement. Very important topic there. Then the 60s, it begins to expand. Remember, it's not just, it's mostly fighting against Jim Crow de jure segregation, but there's also a lot of fighting against de facto segregation. So down south, the goal is to be able to provoke people in order to attack civil rights movement leaders and marchers, and then they get national sympathy on television, and then the federal government has to intervene. So there's like the Little Rock Nine, there's the Montgomery bus boycott, there's the March on Selma, there's Birmingham and all the protests there, and the Children's March, MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, all that stuff. They start to get rid of a lot of segregation laws. The problem is that eventually the civil rights movement is going to both expand and fragment. It expands because it inspires other people to fight for their rights. You have Betty Friedan and feminism. You have Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and the Chicano Si Se Puede movement. You have AIM, the Native Americans taking over and fighting for their rights. You have the Stonewall riots and LGBT people fighting for rights. There's all sorts of rights movements that get inspired by that. So that's the expansion part. But in terms of the fragmentation part, that's when the African-American civil rights movement starts to bump up against the problem of, okay, we've gotten rid of all the laws that are segregating us, but what about the parts of society? What about the economics, especially, that are keeping us as second-class citizens? And you see people like Baird Rustin and MLK starting to take their shift away from simply getting rid of laws to, okay, how can we make this about poor people? How can we make sure the inner city that's been redlined into obsolescence for a long time? How can we make sure that we lift up these people? If we say you're free to do whatever you want, you don't have money to do it, it's kind of a meaningless freedom. So then we start to see the rise of Black Power, Huey Newton and the Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael and Black Power, etc. And that'll fragment the movement, Malcolm X, etc. How do we fight against this new stuff? If you can't pass a law to say, hey, we should be more fair in economics. I mean, you could, but it's a lot harder than saying no more segregation. So it requires new kinds of laws, and the civil rights movement gets completely taken over by Vietnam. Vietnam is going to suck all the attention, all of the resources away from President Johnson and his Great Society, which was an attempt to deal with the civil rights movement. Remember, the Great Society is kind of like Lyndon Baines Johnson or LBJ's New Deal. So the 30s and the 60s are somewhat similar in that regard. This is when he creates Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, the National Endowment for the Humanities, those kinds of excellent programs. And yet he's not able to fund those as well because Vietnam just takes over. In terms of Vietnam, you need to know that this was a big deal both at home and abroad. This is the United States pursuing containment. Vietnam-specific containment is called the domino theory. And the United States supports South Vietnam just like we supported South Korea, and a rather brutal, undemocratic dictatorship, but it's not communist, and therefore we're okay with it, fighting against the North, and then also South Vietnamese communist rebels known as the Viet Cong. So the United States starts to fight. We get there gradually during the 40s and 50s, thanks to advisors, early 60s. Gulf of Tonkin incident in 64 is when we really get involved, and then it just sucks a whole bunch of life out of the United States. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers go, tens of thousands die, protests at home. People are against this, especially the youth movement creates a generational gap, and people don't like it. We talked about LBJ's Great Society already. My apologies. We talked about expanding civil rights as well. There's the youth culture. So this would be the counterculture of the 60s, the hippies, the Woodstock sort of thing. Also a lot of anti-war protests. This is the baby boom generation going then to college for the first time in the 60s and 70s. And so be aware of them and sort of the new rock and roll stuff, moving less away from like Elvis stuff into more of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, etc. There's going to be the environment and societal changes. The environment's going to be a big cause. We see the rise, thanks to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, of environmentalism. People are concerned about this. There were thousands of people dying from smog, from acid rain, from burning rivers that were so polluted they would catch on fire. Yeah, rivers on fire. This is bad. And so in the 70s, Nixon is going to help to pass things like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, which seems kind of weird for a Republican. But at the time, the Republicans kind of cared about the environment too. And so he's passing those laws that drastically clean up our rivers and our cities and our air quality, which is fantastic. A lot of societal changes happen during this time. Women begin to get more rights. They begin to protest for more rights. There's things like Roe v. Wade, which legalizes abortion. There's a whole bunch of controversy over that, but also over women in the workplace. Feminism becomes more of on the rise. And then societal changes in terms of youth culture. We've already talked about that. People begin to trust the government way less. And as you can kind of see, it's kind of summarized in all of here. But one thing that you should maybe focus on at the end of period 8 is the Ford and Carter administrations. The United States begins to realize that Vietnam really hurt us. And we start to focus more at home on things like the misery index, the level of unemployment plus the level of inflation, and high unemployment and high inflation is something called stagflation. The economy does not do very well after the mid-1960s. And by 1970, people are getting really angry. The president obviously doesn't control the economy, but there are policies that can be put in place to make it better or worse, largely, delayed by a couple of years. So it's largely going to be LBJ's Great Society, LBJ's spending in Vietnam that's going to undermine the Great Society and therefore lead to inflation because the government's spending too much money in a variety of ways, and it just doesn't work out very well in the 1970s. And although it gets blamed on Ford and Carter, it's not really their fault as much as it is just a consequence of Nixon and Johnson and Vietnam and stuff like that. Plus, there's all of those energy problems, etc. Let's see. So that was kind of my period 8 highlight. Just a couple of reminders really quick, and then I'll get to your questions. Make sure you're thinking about those historical thinking skills. So regardless of how you're going to be reviewing for this really weird APUSH exam that we just heard about, you want to make sure that you're keeping these 3 things in mind. These are the big 3 historical thinking skills, along with, of course, contextualization. But CCOT, or change in continuity over time, talk about rights. What sort of rights changed? What sort of rights didn't change? Talk about the government. Why did Americans begin to lose all kinds of faith in government thanks to things like the credibility gap during Vietnam or Watergate, or people lying about trying to spy on people at home and abroad, right? There's a variety of reasons why Americans lose trust in their government. Comparison, like I said, 20s and 50s, you need to be able to compare those. Compare hippies in the 60s to flappers in the 20s. Compare and contrast Vietnam and Korea, for example. Interesting. Cause and effect. Technology changes during this time period, right? People begin to have more consumer goods during the 50s. We get things like dishwashers, microwaves. Cars become even more common than before, thanks to suburbs and kind of the other way around too. And so technology changes a whole bunch. Nuclear power plants become a thing. Early computers become a thing. Not personal computers quite yet, but we're getting there. So just a variety of ways to think about it. Let me deal with some of your questions there. Let's see. Rachel wants to do some period 7. Just make sure I'm all clear. I'm ready to go here. And then when do Democrats become liberal and Republicans conservative? And then explain political beliefs in the early to mid 1900s or the change throughout APUSH. And conservative, Democrat, liberal, conservative beliefs, left wing, etc. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's a whole lot of stuff. Okay. Let me just quickly tackle period 7. And then we'll talk about the questions about politics and political parties. So period 7, couple of quick reviews for period 7. Remember, that goes from 1890 until 1945. So you need to know a variety of things for that. Would it help if I wrote some of these down? Maybe throw that in the chat. Would it help if I wrote some of these things down, make kind of a new slide and then typed as we went? I'll see if I can do that. But some of this stuff is a little bit on the fly. So, yeah, we'll see. Let's see. If we're looking at, let's say, period 8. There we go. So we said period 7. Let's do some period 7 highlights. And I want myself a text box. You're getting to see the magic behind all of this, folks. This is amazing. This is where the magic happens. Lots of making slides and things like that. If this would be helpful, let me know in the chat. If this is not helpful and you're like, I didn't come here to see you make slides. What is this? I'd rather just have you talk. Feel free to let me know. It appears like some of this is rather frozen right now, so we'll see how this goes. I'll try to make it such that you can actually see some of it, and we'll keep it consistent. All right, so some period 7 highlights. This is 1890 to 1945. Make that a little bit bigger. How's that? Perfect. Some big topics you need to be aware of. U.S. imperialism is going to be a big deal during this time period. Now you're going to have to watch me type live, and it's going to be all embarrassing. U.S. imperialism is a big deal. So this includes the Spanish-American War. This includes dollar diplomacy. We are seeing a sacred process. Please continue. All right. Glad you like that. Yeah. So U.S. imperialism is going to be a really big deal. You should be aware of some of the motivations. The United States wants territory overseas for coaling stations. They want to be able to rule over everyone. There's that racism stuff, right? The white man's burden, Anglo-Saxon superiority. There's also going to be some progressivism. And so progressives, I put that in period 6 myself just because I feel like it made more sense as kind of a response to the period 6 Gilded Age stuff. But period 7 technically includes the progressives. So you need to know about the progressive reform movements. You need to know about amendments 16, 17, 18, 19. Remember, you can remember amendments 13 through 19 by remembering free citizens. So free from the slaves, citizenship. Free citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. So direct election of senators. Sorry. Free citizens. yeah. Here we go. Free citizens vote to tax, direct taxation, senators who drink with women. That's how I always remember 13 through 19. I'll say that one more time, starting with 13. Free, equal citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. Free, equal citizens vote to tax senators who drink with women. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to do in a small webcam. Feeling a little claustrophobic here. Doing okay with that? So freedom for the slaves, equality under law and citizenship, voting for African-American males, at least somewhat, loopholes, taxation, income tax, senators, direct election of senators, drink, that one's prohibition because you can't drink when you're 18, women's rights, who drink with women, women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Okay, so progressivism, you need to know about like Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson. They pass a variety of reforms aimed at trying to make the government better. Jane Addams, Hull House, things like that. Remember that progressives believed in expert control, and so they want experts to be in charge. Just for sake of time, I'm going to keep moving on. You have things like World War I. That's part of U.S. imperialism too. Why do we get involved? Who cares? How does it change us back at home? Makes us afraid of immigrants. You need to be aware of the 1920s, and that's going to include all sorts of things. Cultural changes, flappers, fundamentalists, the Scopes Monkey trial, jazz, prohibition, questions a lot over culture, Marcus Garvey, back to Africa stuff, U.S. mostly isolationism or at least unilateralism. We're not that involved, and pretty much hands off, which then, of course, leads us to the 1930s and the Great Depression. Oh, no. The Great Depression is not good. That happens with the stock market crash in 1929. Ooh, by the way, too good to pass up. I saw this meme the other day that said, ooh, 2020, the roaring 20s are here. And then history's like, oh, really? How about a pandemic like the Spanish flu in 1919 that lasts until the 20s? Oh, no, we didn't mean that. How about the stock market crashes? Oh, no, we didn't want that. Ooh, how about all your bars are closed? Oh, no, we didn't want that either. Like prohibition. So be aware that the 20s are somewhat similar to today in a variety of really sad ways. Great Depression, that's going to include then, of course, the New Deal. The New Deal is FDR's response to the Great Depression. You should be aware of that. Yeah, Perla, I really like, I think it was Mark Twain, although, it was always Mark Twain, and allegedly said, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I really like that. Like, it's clearly not the same, right? But it's very, very similar. It has some cycles, and it does rhyme. It has some similarities. You should be aware of the New Deal, who likes it, who doesn't like it, some of the programs that it does. That's a good idea. And then, of course, World War II. World War II is going to do a variety of things, especially when it changes American society. World War II is going to change things for women, for African Americans, etc. Yeah, there's probably some more stuff in there that we don't have time to go over right now, but that's your brief overview of period 7. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Spanish influenza was a really big deal. That started actually in France, but they blamed it on the Spanish, as far as I know. But that was an influenza epidemic very similar to the COVID-19 coronavirus, and it spread all over the world. There's a ton of articles. If you just Google coronavirus, Spanish flu, I've read a ton of things over the last couple of days that compare the two. Some of which are like, be very afraid. Some of which are like, hey, we've been here before. It's okay. Here's what to do. Learn from history. But it absolutely was a global thing. The problem was all the soldiers that were in Europe fighting World War II got that flu and then brought it back home, and it spread all over the place. If your school is closed right now and you've talked about flattening the curve, maybe you've heard about that. If not, look it up. A really good example actually comes from the United States during the Spanish flu epidemic when Philadelphia did not cancel one of its parades, and then huge numbers of people got sick. St. Louis, by contrast, closed everything down and flattened the curve and managed to get through it just fine. People died, of course, a few numbers, but like way less, and they could actually handle it with their healthcare capacity. So yeah, lots of interesting comparisons there. I can throw some resources your way at some point. So that's kind of your period 7 overview, just as a quick review. Let's deal with some of these other things. Everyone wants to talk about liberals and conservatives and all that kind of stuff. Who was the most effective president in terms of legislation in that period, says Isaiah? Oof, that one's really tough. I mean, a lot of them did a lot of good stuff. It really depends. I'm partial myself to LBJ and his Great Society, although Vietnam is such a downside, right? Nixon passes so many good things, but Watergate's a huge downside. The man was a scummy crook. Eisenhower does the interstate highway system. That's fantastic. And integration of a lot of stuff. So yeah, we had a lot of very effective presidents during period 8, even though Gerald Ford wasn't president for a long time, even though Nixon was kind of a crook and undermined our whole political system. Yeah, I'd have to go with either Eisenhower or Johnson. Yeah. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Talking about conservatives and Democrats. Okay. Oh boy. This is when I wish I had like a tablet with something to write on. So let's make another slide. This is a sacred process. So hang on. See if we can make another one. Here we go. Actually, let's not make one of those. I'm gonna get rid of this screen sharing, and let's just talk here, because that'll take too long to be able to create something like that. So I'm gonna stop sharing and then just. Oh no, now it's just me. All right. So a couple of things. Help me out with the chat really quick. If I go like this, is that on the right side of your screen or is it on the left side of your screen? Because this is my right hand. It's on the left side of your screen. I'm going to have to do everything in reverse. That's really confusing. Okay. So maybe I'll just describe some of this. Thanks for helping me out, Perla and Danielle. So when it comes to political parties, the terms left and right go way back to English Parliament. We don't necessarily need to worry about that, but left was over here for you folks. Right was over here. If you go extreme left, you get communism. If you go extreme right, you get fascism, sort of in the middle. I really like some of those. If you look at the political parties poster, that's pretty handy and very useful. I'd look at some of that. But let's just pick up where we kind of left off here. So in period 7, the parties were pretty similar. They were both claiming to be progressive toward the beginning. The Republicans tended to be the party of big business, more so than the Democrats, think William Jennings Bryan, etc. But you're also going to see the rise of FDR. And FDR was a liberal Democrat, liberal in the sense that he believed in a big role for the federal government, see the whole New Deal. Were there conservative Democrats at the time? Yes, absolutely. There were conservative Democrats, especially down south, who had been Democrats since the beginning of the Democratic Party, very interested in segregation, etc. And that's one of the reasons why the New Deal was so segregated. In order to have it pass, FDR had to get the support of his Southern Democratic colleagues, partially because they got seniority because they were there for so long, and therefore they were in charge of all the committees. After World War II, the Republican Party starts to get a little bit more conservative, partially in reaction to and opposition to FDR's New Deal and its legacy. They thought it was going to be a little bit more. Well, they didn't like it because they thought it was going to be temporary or it was too big government, but some Democrats felt that way too. The big change is going to happen in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's really, really hard to talk about this without getting fairly controversial. Yeah, third-party candidates, who knows? Divergence law suggests that it wouldn't be, but we'll see. Yeah, Susan, I can send the slide link to you for sure. So during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the two parties start to switch a little bit. And I'm going to throw the link into the chat here a second. There you go. There's the link to the slides if you are curious. I'll update some of those because, you know, some of them were done on the fly, a little ad hoc. But hopefully they were still useful for you. Let's go back to that political stuff. So the United States has two political parties. They're largely heterogeneous. They kind of mix together a little bit. But then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it starts to change. Again, this is controversial. I'll try to be as fair as possible to both sides. One of the big changes is going to be Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. After the Supreme Court decides to intervene and stop segregating public schools, the South gets really, really angry about this. They want segregation. Conservatives want segregation. Well, Eisenhower enforces that, and he's a Republican, so he's kind of a liberal Republican. That's kind of weird. LBJ is a Democrat. He enforces integration as well. But then when Johnson comes into office and starts pushing pushing integration, passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Johnson says, after he passes those, you know, I think we just lost the South for a generation. So the South had always been conservative, always, since the time of the colonies, right? The South was pretty conservative. We're speaking in generalities here, right? There were plenty of liberal and progressive people down south too, and plenty of conservative people up north. But as a whole, the solid South was fairly conservative, right? So that meant Jeffersonian small government. That meant Jacksonian power to the people. That meant conservative, don't take away my slaves, Democrats in the 1850s. But by that time, by the 1960s, Johnson is a liberal Democrat and therefore his support for civil rights starts to push conservatives into the Republican camp. The Republicans realize this, and they realize they can start winning elections if they start taking in more of those conservative people. So that a lot of them embrace, like Senator Strom Thurmond, for example, famous segregationist, actually switches parties. So there are plenty of examples of conservative Democratic senators who switch parties and become Republicans. This is, by the way, side note, this is why it really bothers me when people are like, the Republicans are the party of Lincoln and the Democrats are the party of the KKK. Was that true back in the 1800s? Yes, but they have nothing to do with each other now. Or even when people would say things like, the Republicans are the, it's different, right? So Strom Thurmond is a Democrat who is against the Civil Rights Bill, who then after it gets passed by Democrats and Republicans, switches to be more Republican. They start to become sorted, is one of the terms that we use in political science. The parties become polarized and sorted, so that way if you're conservative, you tend to be more Republican. If you're liberal, you tend to be more Democratic after that. There's a variety of other reasons. Some of it has to do with school integration. Some of it has to do with civil rights. But then you have to know that during the 70s, there's also a bunch of different rights movements that sometimes take it too far in the minds of some people. And so charitably, some of the rise in conservative Republicans is tied to Roe v. Wade and an opposition to abortion. So people like Jerry Falwell and Bob Jones, who actually start off being really conservative because they want to segregate their schools and keep out black people, they realize that's not really a winning issue. And so they start to transition from, I want a small government that can't integrate my schools, to I want a small government that also protects life. And that's going to be more appealing to the so-called Christian right. And so you get Christians who tend to be fairly conservative on social issues, tend to be, especially evangelical Christians. And they start to vote more Republican after the late 1970s, and the rise of Reagan in the 80s, right? Partially due to that. So they're calling for protection of the unborn, opposition to feminism, opposition to the Great Society, opposition to the spending from the Great Society, opposition to civil rights. I don't want to paint conservative as just being like this backlash, but it kind of is. The conservative rise in the 70s and 80s is a backlash to the liberal consensus of the 60s and the 50s that in the minds of some people went way too far, especially when it comes to feminism and abortion, school integration, busing, and things like that. So that'd be sort of a brief answer. Are there any current senators and Republicans that have switched parties? Yeah, there was one that just happened. I can't tell you off the top of my head right now, but there have been some Republicans. There was one Republican that I think switched to be a Democrat recently. It happens every so often. It's not super common, but I'd say it happens maybe 2-3 times a decade recently. Anyway, so again, big picture here. Associating liberals with Democrats and conservative with Republican is a new thing. It's basically only true, and it really even it continues until 1994 with the new Gingrich and the contract with America. That's going to increase the polarization and the separation and sorting a lot too. So the modern day where everyone's just super polarized, and even though the Republicans have moved farther to the right than the Democrats have moved to the left, both parties have sort of shifted a little bit and sorted themselves. And so that's kind of a more recent phenomenon. So conservative, that's always been a thing. Liberal or progressive, that's always been a thing. But associating them with a particular party, don't do that unless it's after the 1970s, and it gets troubling before then. Let's see. So for the new AP test, are we just going to cover the parties before the change? Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like Isaiah just asked a question, the rises in conservatism and liberalism have happened recently. Yeah, that's like a period 9 question. I think it's curious, and maybe we can cover that in a stream at a later time. But yeah, for this new AP test, I would focus on mostly the earlier time periods and the earlier political parties. So start off with your Federalists, Anti-Federalists, pro-Constitution, anti-Constitution. You could kind of call the Federalists progressive and the Anti-Federalists conservatives somewhat. It's not really that useful at that point. They're kind of a one-party system, one-issue system. But then you get into the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists are kind of conservative in some areas. And the Democratic Republicans are conservative and liberal in different areas. So it gets complicated. After the Federalist and Democratic Republican breaks down, then you have the era of good feelings for a little bit with just Jeffersonian Democrats. But then you get the rise of the National Republicans that become the Whigs. Be aware of the Whigs and the Democrats, Jackson all the way to the Civil War. And then, yeah, new AP test, it's just from periods 1 through 7. That's correct. Yep. So that means 1491, symbolically, the pre-Columbian societies, all the way through the end of World War II, 1945. So I would definitely start your review there. Remember, I mentioned this earlier, but the 5 cram passes, if you get one of those, next week I'm starting to review periods 1 through 3, the whole thing. So that would be a good idea if you're curious in doing some of those things. Was capitalism basically just believing laissez-faire? Also, what's free market again? Yeah, kind of a economic question there. Capitalism is kind of the same thing as free market, and it often does involve laissez-faire, although not necessarily entirely. Bofu, you can go ahead and get those on fiveable.me. I'll put that link in the chat there a second. If you click on that, you should be able to see, I guess you can't click on it, but if you go there, you should be able to see it at the top. There's cram passes, things you can do. I don't know what the price is off the top of my head right now. Maybe check into that. Let's see. Shoot, someone was asking a question earlier. What was the one that was just asked? Oh, yeah, capitalism and laissez-faire. So capitalism often involves laissez-faire, but it's not always 100%. Like the United States right now in 2020 is a capitalist free market society, but it has elements of socialism in it, such as Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, or the fact that the government has the post office or other things like that. It's not 100% laissez-faire. Even during the Gilded Age, when there was a lot of laissez-faire, right, and the robber barons and the captains of industry stuff, it wasn't really that laissez-faire. The government intervened on the side of big business all the time against workers, especially in unions, with union busting, then during the progressive era, trust busting, things like that. So yeah, capitalism is basically the same thing as free market. So law of supply and demand, you have a lot of options. You can make a lot of decisions yourself. It's not a command economy if you're taking economics. Laissez-faire is hands-off. That tends to be associated with the economy of the 1920s, of the Gilded Age, and then kind of today. Some interesting comparisons there. But otherwise, I'd say, yeah, that's kind of what you need to know about that. Don't worry about it too much, especially after period 7. Well, it's been an hour, folks. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for checking in. If you're a member of my class, my APUSH class from Holland Christian High School, we'll be seeing you again soon. I'll be pushing out some updates, hopefully today, tomorrow, this weekend, so we can kind of see what's going on once we hear more. Everybody else, continue to look for the College Board announcements. Continue to look for that cram pass if you're interested in seeing more of me doing some review, starting with periods 1 through 3 next week. Remember, there's lots of other reviews that are coming up in the coming weeks and days here at Fiveable, both free and under the cram pass. So regardless of what happens with the College Board, take a deep breath. You folks got this. We'll be here with updates and here with support all the way through the end. So you folks will be great. I hope you're staying safe. You're staying sane. Wash your hands, of course. Keep updated, but don't keep so updated that you freak out every time there's news. You folks are great. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your answers and your engagement. And have a fantastic night. Goodbye.